Okay, we're in the second paragraph of the Shema. After the obligation of a father teaching his son Torah, and to understand that he must engage in the Torah study regardless of the setting, with whether it's at his home, in a distracted setting such as traveling, when you lie and you rise. Then we continue. You must write it on your doorposts, on the doorposts of your house, and on your gates. This is the basis why we must put a mezuzah on your home. We have at the end of the first paragraph and the end of the second paragraph. Now, on which doorpost do you put a mezuzah? You put it on the right doorpost, entry. At the entry point, because in Hebrew, bayis means a house. Beischa grammatically means your house, but it also could be read bi'oscha, on the doorpost of your entry. So it's always, we'll see them on why it's the right side. Going in, it's not going out. It's always on the right side on the entry point. How do we know it's the right side rather than the left side? So the Talmud says most people are right-handed. When we say put your right foot first, a right-handed person, when he walks, his right foot precedes his left foot. So when you enter into it through a doorway, what do you favor? What do you notice first? What's on the right side or the left side? What's on the right side, right? Because if you're going with your right foot first, you're favoring the right over the left. So you notice what's on the left doorpost or the right doorpost rather than what's on the left doorpost. So it's read al mezuzas bi'oscha, the doorpost of your entry point of your home and also your gate. You have to put the mezuzah. That's a positive commandment. The Midrash tells us that normally you have a palace and you have gatekeepers. The gatekeepers in the palace, they protect the various entry points into the palace to protect the king. But yet, as Jews, we find it just to the contrary. God says, you put the mezuzah on your doorpost, and I will protect your home. But the king protects the subject. That if you fill this positive commandment of putting mezuzah on your doorpost, God stands guard at your door that something which could happen will not happen. That's al mezuzahs beisech v'sharecho. There's a parchment in that mezuzah that contains the first two paragraphs of the Shema. That's what's on that parchment. And when it's written with on a special kind of parchment that it was actually processed for the sake of a mezuzah. And when the scribe wrote it, he writes it in a very specific font, and it's written by hand, and he has to write it for the sake of doing the mitzvah of writing a mezuzah. And if he meets all that criteria, then that mezuzah has that innate value, that innate holiness, that it qualifies to put on your doorpost, and through that you fulfill the mitzvah of having mezuzah on your doorpost. But as many entry locations you have in your home, it's not only the front door, it's every room in your house that has a doorpost and it has to have a lintel. It's not enough just to have, let's say the doorpost goes up to the ceiling and there's no lintel coming down. That's not called a doorway. A doorway means it has to be shaped like the doorway where there's a lintel coming down from the top. So the doorway we're talking about has the doorpost and it has something above the doorpost, which is called the lintel. Then you have the obligation to put the mezuzah on the right side of that doorway at the entry point. So let's say you have a door, which is an emergency exit, which you can only leave, but you can't come in from the outside. That doorway doesn't need a mezuzah because it's always the entry point of that door. And since there's no entry point, because that door is only an exit door, it's not an entry door, therefore one does not have an obligation of mezuzah on that doorpost. Now, just to give you a little bit of an understanding of the halacha, what happens if you rent an apartment? It's not your residence. You rent it. On the Torah level, you have no obligation to put a mezuzah because it's not your home. However, rabbinically, if you're there for 30 days, since 30 days is considered a substantial amount of time and it's perceived as if it is your residence, therefore, rabbinically, you have to put a mezuzah on that doorpost. On that doorpost. But before 30 days, you have no obligation to put up that mezuzah. Because since you're there less than 30 days, it doesn't appear to be your residence unless in reality is your residence. That's number one. Secondly, let's say a person is a real estate owner and he owns apartments and they're vacant. So they're all his apartments. Someone else is not living in the apartment. Do you have an obligation to put a mezuzah on those apartment doors, on the rooms in those apartments? The answer is no. It's only if you're living there. If you're living in the residence, that's when you have an obligation to put the mezuzah on those doorposts. So let's say you go take a trip for 6 months. It's still your residence. What about if you have an apartment, your belongings are in that apartment? You're not there, but you haven't yet moved out your belongings. That's called your residence. Because since it contains your belongings, your possessions, that's called your residence. You have an obligation to put the mezuzah on the doorposts of every one of those rooms. So a person's a real estate owner, landlord, and the apartments are empty, and he doesn't have his furniture in those apartments, so his possessions are not there. The landlord has no obligation to put a mezuzah on those doorposts on the entry, the front door, the back door, any of the other doors of entry into the residence itself. That is the law. Now, what's a person? The Torah tells us that if you wear a four-cornered garment, you must put tzitzis on your garment. What happens if you don't own the garment? It's a borrowed garment. Because it says it must be your garment. So let's say you borrow a garment. Unless you use that garment for 30 days, you have no obligation to put tzitzis on that garment. Similar to the residence. Rabbinically, something you possess for 30 days and use it for 30 days, then it's perceived and believed that it's yours. Therefore, rabbinically, you must put tzitzis on that garment. The residence, if you occupy it for 30 days or more, you must put the mezuzah up because it's perceived and it's believed that it's your residence. But it's rabbinical. But if you own a residence, the moment you put your things in that residence, from day one, you must, on a Torah level, you must have a mezuzah on every one of those doorposts in that residence. That's the law. But it's all based upon the first and second paragraph of the Shema, that you must put the mezuzah on the doorposts. Mezuzah means the doorposts. Now, preferably when you put a mezuzah on the doorpost, it should be within your eye range. Let's say you have a doorpost, it's 15 feet high, and it's about 10 feet above your head. When you walk through that door, visually, you don't see the mezuzah up there. Even if you put a mezuzah, it's valid, but it's not the optimum location. It's when you walk through the door, you should notice it. It has nothing to do with kissing it. Nothing with kissing it. Because when you notice that, and it has a certain level of representation, that God's presence is associated with that residence, or with that entry point. Okay? L'man yibu yemechem, we conclude, this is the conclusion of the second paragraph of the Shema. So your day should be lengthened, maybe nechem, and the days of your children, al hadamo, on the earth, asher nishba Hashem lavusechem, which God had promised to your forefathers, meaning the study of Torah. If you want to have longevity, long days for you and your children, you should teach your child Torah and study the Torah. Asher nishba Hashem lavusechem, losis lohem, to give it to them, kimei hashamayim al oretz, like the days of the heaven on earth. That's the conclusion of the second paragraph of the Shema. It's a known fact that if tragedies take place very often, if the mezuzah is not written correctly, a mezuzah has to be checked every once in a while. Why? Because if it's as a result of the moisture on the walls, that moisture could cause the letter to actually become brittle or whatever it is, and therefore it has to be checked. It should be checked twice in 7 years. What about initially the mezuzah was never written correctly, or the tefillah was never written correctly? It has very serious consequences. There was a case 2 years ago. There's a certain person associated with Yad Avram. His child came down with a brain tumor. And the parents, and he was only 14 years old at the time, he was told, check his tefillin. And they checked the tefillin. And they found, it says, you should put it as frontlets between your eyes. That means on your head. Somehow over there, it was never written properly. And without saying that's the reason why it happened. But, whenever you do a mitzvah, it protects you. And if you're lacking in the protection, you become vulnerable, God forbid, for many things. So since the area where he could have merited protection, the tefillin were not valid because it was never written correctly, either because the letters were touching or whatever else. So the tefillin he wore on his head were never valid tefillin from the time he was bar mitzvah going forward. Ultimately, he died of this brain tumor, this young child. He was maybe 14, 15 years old. That's what happened. And also we check mezuzahs. If things go awry, and the first thing they said, check your mezuzahs. And very often you find the mezuzah is not kosher, either was never written properly or became invalidated. And due to that level of validation, you don't merit that protection, and therefore you become vulnerable, God forbid, for certain things.
Here, Rabbi.
No progress.